The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, passengers gripping armrests as coffee spilled onto tray tables. In row 9, seat C, a woman in faded jeans and a Northwestern University sweatshirt stared out the oval window, watching storm clouds swallow the horizon like hungry ghosts. Her reflection revealed tired eyes, prematurely lined from years of squinting into desert sun and cockpit displays. Nobody on Flight 447 knew that Lieutenant Colonel Zara Phoenix Nakamura had logged over 3,000 combat hours in F-16 Fighting Falcons across 2 theaters of war. The plane lurched violently, oxygen masks deployed with mechanical precision, yellow plastic cups dangling like dead flowers. Children screamed. Adults prayed in languages she recognized from her deployments: Arabic, Farsi, Pashto. The familiar metallic taste of adrenaline flooded her mouth as she assessed the situation with military precision. Engine failure. Dual engine failure, judging by the asymmetric vibration pattern, and the pilot's increasingly desperate radio calls bleeding through the intercom static. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We're experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be making an emergency descent. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions. His voice carried the forced steadiness of a man walking a tightrope over an abyss. Phoenix had heard that tone before in her own voice when she'd guided damaged aircraft through missile-painted skis over Kandahar. She closed her eyes, muscle memory transforming the commercial cabin into a familiar cockpit. Her hands moved unconsciously through emergency procedures, fuel management, engine restart attempts, alternate landing calculations. The mathematics of survival played out in her mind like a chess match against death itself. Wind speed, altitude loss rate, glide ratio, available airports within range. The numbers painted a grim picture. Through the intercom crackle, she caught fragments of air traffic control communications. Declaring emergency, souls on board 147, nearest suitable airport. Captain Morrison's responses grew shorter, more clipped. Professional fear, she recognized it immediately. He was running out of options and time. A flight attendant stumbled past her row, tears streaming down her face despite her practiced smile. Phoenix grabbed her wrist gently. "What's our current altitude and descent rate?" she asked quietly. The young woman's eyes widened at the technical question from a passenger in tourist class. I don't know, ma'am. Please just put on your oxygen mask." Phoenix had spent her military career being underestimated. Too small for fighters, they'd said initially. Too emotional for command positions. Too reckless for strategic missions. Yet she'd earned her call sign Phoenix, not for rising from ashes, but for bringing dead aircraft back to life when everyone else had written them off. As the 737 continued its terrifying descent through the storm, she realized that today, surrounded by 146 strangers at 40,000 feet, her greatest test wasn't behind her in some forgotten desert. It was beginning right now, in Seat 9C, where nobody knew her name. The aircraft banked sharply left. Through her window, Phoenix glimpsed the geometric patterns of farmland far below, growing larger with each passing second. Time was running out for everyone aboard Flight 447, and the only person who might save them was sitting anonymously in row 9, watching the ground rush up to meet them like an old enemy she'd faced many times before. Captain Morrison's voice returned, shakier now. "Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing." The words hung in the recycled air like a death sentence. Phoenix unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, knowing that her war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Phoenix moved through the cabin with purposeful calm, her training overriding civilian protocols. She'd spent years in cockpits where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and body bags. The familiar weight of responsibility settled across her shoulders like an old flight jacket. Passengers around her sobbed and hyperventilated, but she felt the strange peace that came with clarity of purpose. She approached the cockpit door, nodding the flight attendants' nervous glances. Through the reinforced barrier, she could hear Captain Morrison's increasingly desperate radio communications. "Tower, we've lost both engines. Attempting restart procedures. Need immediate vectors to nearest suitable runway." His co-pilot's voice joined in, running through emergency checklists with mechanical precision that couldn't hide underlying panic. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. United 447, dual engine failure, 147 souls on board, requesting priority handling." The words carried weight she knew too well. She'd made similar calls over hostile territory, but at least then she'd only been responsible for herself. This was different. This was 146 lives depending on two pilots who might not have the experience for what was coming. Phoenix knocked on the cockpit door, 3 firm raps, not the desperate pounding of a panicked passenger. When the door cracked open, she saw Captain Morrison's stress-lined face and his co-pilot frantically working instruments. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Zara Nakamura, United States Air Force," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I have extensive multi-engine experience and emergency landing procedures. I can help." Morrison's eyes narrowed. Military bearing or not, she was still a passenger in civilian clothes making an outrageous claim. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but—" "Captain," she interrupted, using the tone that had commanded respect in briefing rooms from Ramstein to Bagram. "Check your airspeed indicator against your artificial horizon. You're in an approach stall configuration at cruise altitude. Your angle of attack is too aggressive for your current power setting. If you don't adjust immediately, you'll enter an unrecoverable spin in approximately 90 seconds. Morrison's hands froze on the controls. His co-pilot, a younger man named Henderson according to his name tag, stared at her with something approaching hope. The technical accuracy of her assessment was impossible to fake. Morrison made the correction automatically, muscle memory responding to her words before his conscious mind could process the implications. "How did you?" he began. "Because I've been exactly where you are right now," Phoenix replied, stepping into the cockpit uninvited. "Except my situations usually involved surface-to-air missiles and hostile territory. May I suggest we discuss my credentials later and focus on getting this aircraft on the ground intact?" The storm outside painted the windscreen with sheets of rain. Lightning illuminated towering cumulonimbus clouds that rose like mountains of vapor and electricity. Phoenix's eyes swept the instrument panel, reading the story written in glowing digits and analog gauges. Fuel remaining, altitude loss rate, wind conditions, available airports within gliding distance. The mathematics were brutally simple. They had perhaps 12 minutes before physics made the decision for them. "What's your actual flight time, Colonel?" Henderson asked, his voice carrying desperate hope. 3,200 hours combat, 1,800 hours multi-engine transport," she replied, settling into the observer's seat behind Morrison. "Including emergency landings on damaged runways, carrier approach simulations, and dead-stick landings in aircraft similar to this one. Captain Morrison, with your permission, I'd like to review our options." Morrison nodded slowly. For the first time since the emergency began, Phoenix saw something other than barely controlled panic in his eyes. She saw the beginnings of hope, fragile as morning frost but real nonetheless. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cockpit, 3 pilots began working together to cheat death one more time. The instrument panel told a story Phoenix had read before in different aircraft over different terrain, but the ending was always the same: land successfully or die trying. She cracked her knuckles and got to work, her mind already calculating approaches and contingencies with the cold precision that had kept her alive through 2 combat tours. This time, though, the stakes weren't just her own life. This time, she was fighting for 146 strangers who had no idea their survival might depend on the quiet woman from row 9. Phoenix's fingers traced across the navigation display, muscle memory from countless mission briefings taking over. "Henderson, pull up weather for Columbus, Cincinnati and Indianapolis. I need ceiling, visibility, and wind conditions for all available runways." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd made life-or-death decisions in F-16 cockpits while dodging missile locks. "Columbus is reporting heavy rain, winds gusting to 40 knots," Henderson replied, his voice steadying as they fell into professional rhythm. "Cincinnati has better conditions, light rain, winds 270 at 15 knots. Indianapolis is marginal, low ceiling but manageable." Morrison fought the controls as another wind shear tried to roll the aircraft. "Colonel, what's your assessment of our glide range?" The formal military courtesy in his voice suggested he was beginning to accept her presence as more than passenger interference. Phoenix studied the engine displays, noting the complete absence of thrust indications. Both Pratt and Whitney engines had gone silent, their familiar whine replaced by the whistle of wind over aluminum. "At current weight and descent rate, we have approximately 8 minutes of controlled flight time. Cincinnati is our best option. Longer runway, better approach path, emergency services already positioning." She leaned forward, pointing to the primary flight display. "Captain, may I suggest adjusting your pitch attitude 3 degrees nose up? You're trading altitude for airspeed when we need to maximize glide distance." Morrison complied immediately, the subtle adjustment changing the aircraft's behavior from desperate plunge to controlled descent. "Tower United 447, Morrison transmitted. "Declaring emergency. Dual engine failure, currently at flight level 210, requesting vectors to Cincinnati." His voice carried new confidence, the subtle shift that came from having experienced help in the cockpit. "United 447, Cincinnati Tower, we copy your emergency. Squawk 7700. Turn right heading 240, descend and maintain flight level 180. Emergency vehicles are rolling. Souls on board and fuel remaining." 147 souls, approximately 40 minutes fuel remaining, Morrison replied. Phoenix caught the small lie. They had no fuel flow to measure, but maintaining the illusion of normal operations helped controllers plan the emergency response. Henderson worked his radio stack, coordinating with air traffic control while Phoenix mentally flew the approach. She could visualize Cincinnati's runway layout from memory, long parallel runways with adequate overrun areas, exactly what they needed for a powerless landing. The mathematics were still tight, but achievable with precise execution. "Colonel," Morrison said quietly, "what's your honest assessment of our chances?" Phoenix had been asked that question before, usually while strapped into ejection seats over hostile territory. The truth was always complicated by variables beyond pilot control, weather, mechanical condition, human error under stress. But she'd learned that desperate situations demanded honest hope, not false optimism. "If we maintain current glide performance and the weather holds, we can make Cincinnati with altitude to spare for approach corrections," she replied. "The challenge will be landing without thrust reversers or anti-skid systems. We'll need perfect speed control and maximum aerodynamic braking." Outside the windscreen, the storm began to thin. Patches of clearer air revealed the geometric patterns of Ohio farmland below, growing larger with each passing minute. Phoenix felt the familiar pre-combat calm settling over her thoughts, the mental state where time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. She'd felt it before engaging enemy aircraft, before threading damaged fighters through mountain passes, before every moment when survival depended on perfect execution of imperfect plans. The radio crackled with Cincinnati Tower's voice. "United 447, you're cleared for emergency approach runway 27 left. Wind 260 at 12 knots, visibility 3 miles in light rain. Say your intentions for approach type." Morrison looked at Phoenix questioningly. In that moment, she realized the weight of command had shifted subtly but definitively. He was still the captain, but she had become the tactical decision-maker. "Request straight in ILS approach," she replied. "We'll need the longest possible final to configure for landing." As they descended through 15,000 feet, Phoenix began briefing the approach procedures with the methodical precision that had guided her through combat missions. The storm might be clearing, but the most dangerous part of their flight was still ahead, threading a powerless airliner through weather and terrain to a runway that would give them exactly one chance to get everything right. The approach began 20 miles from Cincinnati, Phoenix's voice guiding Morrison through power-off procedures she'd learned in military emergency training. "Maintain 85% of normal approach speed until we're committed to land," she instructed, watching airspeed indicators like a sniper watching through a scope. "We'll have no go-around capability, so this approach has to be perfect the first time." Henderson monitored their descent rate while coordinating with approach control. "United 447, you're currently 12 miles from runway 27 left. Descend and maintain 3,000 until established on the localizer." The controller's voice carried the professional calm that aviation demanded, but Phoenix caught the underlying tension. Everyone involved knew this landing would either be a textbook emergency procedure or a tragedy measured in twisted metal and lives lost. "Gear down," Morrison called, moving the landing gear lever. The familiar rumble and vibration confirmed mechanical extension, but without engine power, they had no hydraulic pressure for normal brake operation. Phoenix had experienced similar situations in military aircraft, the peculiar helplessness of controlling a machine that responded only to aerodynamic forces. "Flaps to landing configuration," she suggested. "We need maximum lift coefficient for minimum approach speed." The 737 shuddered as wing flaps extended, changing the aircraft's character from sleek cruiser to aerial truck, designed for slow-speed stability rather than efficiency. Through the cockpit windows, Cincinnati's runway lights appeared like a string of pearls against the dark Ohio landscape. Rain continued to spatter the windscreen, but visibility remained adequate for visual approach corrections. Phoenix felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the most experienced person in a crisis, the knowledge that her decisions would determine whether families would be reunited or forever shattered. 5 miles from touchdown," Henderson announced. "Altitude 2,000, speed 140 knots, on glide path." His voice carried the precise cadence of emergency procedures practiced but rarely executed under actual conditions. Phoenix watched Morrison's technique, noting the small corrections and adjustments that marked experienced stick-and-rudder skills. Military training had taught her to assess pilot capability under stress, and Morrison was proving more capable than his initial panic had suggested. Some people rose to challenges while others crumbled. He was clearly in the former category. 3 miles out," she called. "Reduce speed to 125 knots. Start bleeding off excess airspeed for touchdown." The runway grew larger in the windscreen, concrete and lights becoming more defined with each passing second. Emergency vehicles lined the taxiways, fire trucks, ambulances, emergency command posts. The entire apparatus of crash response prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. "United 447, you're cleared to land runway 27 left. Wind 260 at 10 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by." The tower controller's transmission carried finality. This was their one chance. Phoenix's hands hovered near the controls, ready to assist if Morrison needed help, but trying not to interfere with his command authority. She'd learned in combat that two people trying to fly the same aircraft usually resulted in disaster. Better to provide guidance and support while allowing the primary pilot to maintain control. 1 mile out, Henderson called. Speed 120, altitude 500 feet on centerline. The runway threshold rushed toward them, concrete and lights growing from distant points to tangible reality. Phoenix could see individual runway markings, the red approach lights, the foam trucks positioned for immediate response. 50 feet, Morrison called. beginning the flare that would transition their controlled descent into an actual landing. Without engine thrust, the maneuver required perfect timing. Too early would result in a hard landing. Too late would drive them into the runway at dangerous speed. Phoenix held her breath as the main landing gear touched concrete with a solid thump that resonated through the airframe. They were down, but not safe. Now came the real challenge: stopping 40 tons of aircraft with only aerodynamic braking and manual wheel brakes on a rain-slicked runway. The next 30 seconds would determine whether their emergency landing became a survival story or a cautionary tale studied in aviation safety courses. The 737's wheels screamed against wet concrete as Morrison deployed every piece of aerodynamic braking available: spoilers, flaps, even reverse thrust levers that did nothing without engine power. Phoenix felt the familiar deceleration forces that meant the difference between controlled landing and catastrophic overrun. Rain made the runway surface treacherous, but their approach speed had been nearly perfect. "Brakes are holding," Morrison announced, his voice tight with concentration. "Speed decreasing through 80 knots. The runway centerline streaked past the cockpit windows as emergency vehicles paced their deceleration, red and blue lights painting the rain-soaked tarmac in primary colors. Henderson monitored their position. 6,000 feet of runway remaining, speed 70 knots and decreasing. His voice carried cautious optimism. They were going to stop well short of the runway's end, but aviation had taught all of them never to celebrate until the aircraft was completely stopped and engines shut down. Phoenix watched Morrison's technique, noting how he applied brakes in smooth, progressive pressure rather than desperate stabbing motions. Military training had taught her that emergency landings were won or lost in the final seconds, when adrenaline tempted pilots into overcorrection and loss of control. Morrison was proving himself under the ultimate test. 30 knots, Henderson called. 4,000 feet of runway remaining. The massive aircraft continued its deceleration, momentum bleeding away with each yard of concrete beneath their wheels. Through the side windows, Phoenix could see emergency personnel preparing for immediate evacuation procedures, but their body language suggested relief rather than desperate preparation for disaster response. "United 447 is stopped on runway 27 left," Morrison transmitted to tower control, his voice carrying the exhausted satisfaction of someone who just cheated death through skill and determination. "All souls on board are safe. We'll need towing assistance and passenger evacuation via mobile stairs." The tower controller's response came immediately. "United 447, Cincinnati Tower, outstanding job. Emergency vehicles are approaching your position. Remain on this frequency for coordination." Even through radio static, Phoenix could hear genuine admiration in the controller's voice. Phoenix unbuckled her restraints and stood, noting how her hands trembled slightly, the normal post-crisis adrenaline reaction she'd experienced after combat missions. "Captain Morrison, exceptional flying. Henderson, excellent systems management." Her words carried the formal recognition that military culture demanded after successful completion of dangerous operations. Morrison turned in his seat, studying her face with new understanding. "Colonel, I don't know how to thank you. Without your help." He let the unfinished sentence hang in the air, both of them aware of how differently this emergency could have ended. "You would have managed," Phoenix replied, though they all knew that wasn't necessarily true. "You had the skills. You just needed someone to help you access them under stress." It was the kind of leadership lesson she'd learned from her own commanders. Sometimes expertise mattered less than confidence and clear thinking under pressure. Henderson was already coordinating with ground control for passenger evacuation procedures. Through the cockpit windows, they could see mobile stairs approaching while emergency personnel established a safety perimeter. The routine efficiency of post-emergency procedures felt almost surreal after the life-or-death intensity of the previous 20 minutes. The passengers will want to know who helped save them, Morrison said quietly. They deserve to know about the woman in row 9 who knew how to bring dead aircraft back to life. Phoenix shook her head. They'll want to know about the captain who kept his composure and executed a perfect dead-stick landing in weather conditions that would challenge any pilot. That's the story worth telling. She moved toward the cockpit door, preparing to blend back into the crowd of passengers who would disembark as survivors rather than victims. As she reached for the door handle, Morrison called after her, "Colonel Phoenix, it's been an honor flying with you." The use of her call sign stopped her cold. She hadn't mentioned it during the emergency, but somehow he'd intuited the identity that had defined her military career. She turned back with a slight smile. "The honor was mine, Captain. Now let's get these people home to their families." Outside, the first passengers were beginning to disembark, their faces showing the bewildered relief of people who'd looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. Phoenix took her place among them, just another passenger whose feet would touch solid ground because 3 pilots had worked together to defeat physics, weather, and mechanical failure in the span of 20 terrifying minutes above the Ohio landscape. The debriefing room at Cincinnati Airport buzzed with controlled chaos. FAA investigators, airline officials, emergency responders, and media representatives all converging on Flight 447's miraculous survival story. Phoenix sat in a corner chair, still wearing her Northwestern sweatshirt, watching investigators photograph the cockpit and interview crew members with the methodical precision of people who turned disasters into data points. Captain Morrison provided his account to a senior FAA inspector, his words precise and professional despite obvious exhaustion. The dual-engine failure occurred at cruise altitude during severe weather conditions. Our emergency procedures were enhanced by consultation with a qualified military pilot who happened to be traveling as a passenger. His careful phrasing protected Phoenix's privacy while acknowledging her contribution. Henderson nodded agreement during his own interview. The military consultant provided tactical expertise that proved invaluable during approach and landing phases. Her knowledge of emergency procedures exceeded anything in our standard training curriculum. Both pilots maintained the fiction that she'd simply been a helpful passenger rather than the tactical decision-maker who'd guided them through the crisis. Phoenix appreciated their discretion. Military culture valued operational success over individual recognition, and she'd learned long ago that the best missions were often the ones that never made headlines. She'd done her job, the aircraft had landed safely, and everyone was going home alive. That was sufficient reward for a lifetime of training and experience. A young reporter approached her tentatively. "Excuse me, ma'am, I understand you provided assistance during the emergency. Could you comment on what happened up there?" His eagerness was tempered by uncertainty. She didn't look like the typical aviation expert, just another passenger in casual clothes. "The crew did an exceptional job under extremely challenging conditions," Phoenix replied diplomatically. "Captain Morrison and First Officer Henderson executed textbook emergency procedures. I was fortunate to be able to assist in a small way." Her words deflected attention while providing accurate assessment of the crew's performance. The reporter pressed for details, but Phoenix had decades of experience avoiding media attention. Military operations often required anonymity, and she'd mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight. "I think you'll find that the real story is about professional aviation crews who train for emergencies like this their entire careers. Captain Morrison's flying was exceptional." An FAA investigator approached with standard post-incident paperwork. "Ma'am, I need to document your assistance during the emergency. Can you provide your full name and qualifications?" His tone suggested routine data collection rather than recognition of her role in preventing disaster. "Lieutenant Colonel Zara Nakamura, United States Air Force, currently on leave status," she replied, providing the minimum information required. I hold commercial multi-engine ratings and have extensive experience in emergency procedures. She omitted her combat history, classified missions, and the specific details that would transform a simple passenger assistance story into something more complex. The investigator noted her credentials with professional interest. Your input was obviously valuable. Would you be available for follow-up interviews if needed? The question carried the implication that her role might become more significant as the investigation progressed. Of course, Phoenix replied, though she hoped to avoid further attention. Aviation accidents generated months of analysis, and military involvement, even as passenger assistance, could complicate investigations with security considerations and jurisdictional questions. Morrison appeared at her elbow, having finished his formal debrief. Colonel, there's something I want you to know. In 30 years of flying, I've never experienced anything like what happened today. Your presence in that cockpit saved every life on that aircraft. His words carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how close they'd come to disaster. Phoenix nodded acknowledgement without false modesty. Military culture demanded honest assessment of operational results, and she knew her intervention had been decisive. You responded exceptionally well to an impossible situation, Captain. Most civilian pilots never encounter total power failure in actual IMC conditions. Your airmanship under pressure was outstanding. Henderson joined them, looking younger without the stress lines that had marked his face during the emergency. Ma'am, I've been flying for 8 years, and I learned more about emergency procedures in the last hour than in all my previous training combined. Thank you for keeping us focused when everything was falling apart. The three pilots stood together in the busy debriefing room, sharing the quiet understanding that came from successful completion of dangerous operations. Around them, investigators continued their work, transforming their life-or-death experience into technical reports and safety recommendations. But in that moment, they were simply three professionals who'd worked together to defeat the odds and bring 147 people home safely. As evening approached, Phoenix gathered her small carry-on bag and prepared to continue her interrupted journey. The airline had arranged alternate transportation for all passengers, but she'd opted for a rental car and a quiet drive through the Ohio countryside. Sometimes the best way to decompress from crisis was solitude and the simple act of controlling her own movement through space. Outside the terminal, Morrison caught up with her one final time. "Colonel Phoenix," he said, using her call sign with the respect it had earned over years of combat operations. "I know you prefer to avoid recognition, but what you did today deserves to be remembered. You saved lives with knowledge and skill that can't be taught in civilian flight schools." Phoenix paused at the terminal exit, Ohio evening air cool against her face after hours in recycled cabin atmosphere. "Captain, every military pilot trains for the day when our skills might save lives. Today was that day. The fact that it happened in a civilian airliner instead of a combat zone doesn't change the responsibility or the reward." She extended her hand for a final handshake. "Fly safe, Captain Morrison. The skis are a little safer with pilots like you in them." As she walked toward the rental car counter, Phoenix reflected on the strange turns that military careers could take. She'd expected to finish her service in staff positions, planning missions and training younger pilots. Instead, she'd found herself in a powerless airliner over Ohio, using combat experience to guide civilian colleagues through their worst nightmare. Sometimes the most important battles were fought in unexpected places by people nobody saw coming. The rental car was a simple sedan, nothing like the high-performance aircraft she was accustomed to controlling. But as she drove through the quiet Ohio landscape toward her original destination, Phoenix allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Today, her skills had mattered. Today, she'd proven that the years of training, the deployments, the risks taken in distant places had all been preparation for a moment when 147 strangers needed someone who knew how to bring dead aircraft back to life. Behind her, Cincinnati Airport continued its normal operations, Flight 447's emergency already becoming part of aviation history. Ahead lay whatever challenges the future might bring. But in this moment, driving through darkness toward an uncertain tomorrow, Lieutenant Colonel Zara Phoenix Nakamura was simply a woman who'd done her job when it mattered most. 3 months after Flight 447, Phoenix sat in a Pentagon briefing room facing a promotion board that would determine the next phase of her military career. The sterile, fluorescent lighting and government issue furniture felt familiar after 20 years of service, but today's proceedings carried unusual weight. Her emergency assistance had generated significant media attention, despite her efforts to remain anonymous, and the Air Force was deciding how to leverage her newfound notoriety. Colonel Harrison, the board president, reviewed her file with the methodical precision that characterized senior military officers. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura, your actions during the Cincinnati incident have brought considerable positive attention to Air Force training and professionalism. The service is proud of your performance under extraordinary circumstances. Phoenix maintained military bearing while inwardly cringing at the attention. She'd spent her career avoiding publicity, preferring operational effectiveness over recognition. Thank you, sir. I was simply applying standard emergency procedures in an unusual situation. Her response deflected credit while acknowledging the compliment, a skill learned through years of navigating military bureaucracy. The FAA investigation concluded that your intervention was decisive in preventing loss of life, Colonel Harrison continued. Your technical knowledge and command presence under stress exemplified the highest standards of Air Force professionalism. The board is particularly impressed by witness accounts of your tactical decision-making during the approach phase. Major Chen, another board member, leaned forward with interest. Colonel, the media coverage has generated significant public interest in military aviation training. The Air Force Public Affairs Office has received numerous interview requests and speaking opportunities. How do you feel about representing the service in civilian forums? The question carried implications Phoenix recognized immediately. Military careers often pivoted on willingness to accept high-visibility assignments, and her accidental fame created opportunities for service advancement. But she'd always preferred operational assignments to staff positions, flying missions rather than managing public perception. Sir, I'm honored by the confidence, but my preference remains operational flying duties, she replied carefully. I believe my skills are best utilized in training and mission execution rather than public relations activities. The diplomatic language masked her genuine reluctance to become a poster child for military competence. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with other board members before continuing. Lieutenant Colonel, we're prepared to offer you command of the 432nd Training Squadron at Columbus Air Force Base. The position involves developing emergency procedures curriculum and training civilian aviation personnel in military crisis management techniques. It's a newly created position that leverages your unique experience. The offer surprised Phoenix. Command positions at her level were competitive, and the proposed assignment would combine her tactical expertise with the public recognition generated by Flight 447. It represented career advancement while maintaining operational relevance, exactly the kind of assignment she'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. The position would involve significant interaction with civilian aviation authorities, Major Chen added. Your credibility with commercial pilots could help bridge gaps between military and civilian emergency training programs. The FAA has specifically requested Air Force assistance in developing improved dead-stick landing procedures. Phoenix considered the implications. Command of a training squadron meant responsibility for developing the next generation of military pilots while sharing hard-won knowledge with civilian aviation. It was exactly the kind of mission that justified years of combat experience and personal risk. Sir, I'm very interested in the assignment. When would the position become available? Immediately, if you accept, Colonel Harrison replied. The Air Force wants to capitalize on current interest in your expertise. The media attention, while unusual, has created opportunities to showcase military training excellence and improve overall aviation safety. His tone suggested that her decision would significantly impact her future career trajectory. The briefing room fell silent as Phoenix weighed her options. She could decline and return to standard staff assignments, maintaining anonymity while limiting career advancement. Or she could accept command responsibility that leveraged her accidental fame for broader service benefits. The decision would define her remaining military years. "Sir, I accept the command with gratitude," she replied formally. "I look forward to contributing to aviation safety and training excellence." The words felt strange, accepting recognition she'd never sought while embracing responsibilities she'd always wanted. Colonel Harrison smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Congratulations, Colonel Nakamura. Your promotion to full colonel is effective immediately, along with command of the 432nd Training Squadron. The Air Force is fortunate to have officers who exemplify excellence under pressure." He stood and extended his hand in congratulation. As Phoenix shook hands with board members, she reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. A routine commercial flight had become a career-defining event, transforming her from anonymous staff officer to recognized aviation expert. Sometimes military careers were shaped by planned advancement, and sometimes by split-second decisions made in crisis moments high above Ohio farmland. Walking from the Pentagon briefing room, Colonel Zara Phoenix Nakamura felt the weight of new responsibilities settling across her shoulders like familiar flight gear. Command brought opportunities to shape training programs, develop emergency procedures, and pass combat-tested knowledge to the next generation of pilots. Her accidental fame had become a platform for service excellence, exactly what military careers were supposed to achieve, even if the path had been completely unexpected. Outside Pentagon corridors, Washington, D.C. traffic moved with its usual chaotic precision. But for Phoenix, the view had changed entirely. She was no longer the anonymous woman in row 9, traveling to an uncertain future. She was Colonel Nakamura, commander-designate, carrying forward the lessons learned in cockpits over hostile territory and powerless airliners over Ohio. The sky was calling again, but this time she'd be teaching others how to answer. Colonel Phoenix's first month commanding the 432nd Training Squadron exceeded every expectation she'd harbored about military leadership positions. Columbus Air Force Base hummed with activity as her innovative emergency procedures curriculum drew attention from aviation professionals worldwide. The media attention that had initially felt like a burden was transforming into operational advantage, bringing resources and support that enhanced training effectiveness beyond anything she'd previously experienced. Her office overlooked the flight line where T-6 Texan trainers practiced touch-and-go landings in endless repetition, their engines creating a constant backdrop of aviation purpose. Through her windows, she could watch student pilots learning the fundamentals that might one day save lives in circumstances they couldn't imagine. Each landing represented potential future competence in crisis situations, and Phoenix felt deep satisfaction in contributing to that preparation. Captain Rodriguez, her deputy commander, knocked on the door frame before entering with the day's training reports. "Ma'am, the FAA liaison team arrived this morning for the civilian integration program. They're particularly interested in the dead-stick landing simulator modifications you've developed." His enthusiasm reflected the entire squadron's energy. They were pioneering training techniques that could revolutionize aviation safety. "Excellent," Phoenix replied, reviewing performance metrics that showed remarkable improvement in emergency procedure proficiency. "How are our students responding to the enhanced stress training protocols?" She'd insisted on realistic crisis simulation, incorporating lessons learned from both combat operations and commercial aviation emergencies. Outstanding, ma'am. The psychological pressure training is producing pilots who maintain composure under conditions that would have overwhelmed previous training programs, Rodriguez reported. We're seeing students who can think clearly and execute procedures even when multiple systems are failing simultaneously. Phoenix nodded with satisfaction. Military aviation had always emphasized training for worst-case scenarios, but her combat experience and Flight 447 emergency had revealed gaps in traditional instruction. Real crisis management required mental flexibility that could only be developed through systematic exposure to high-stress decision-making. Her intercom buzzed with a call from base operations. Colonel Nakamura, you have a visitor from United Airlines requesting to speak with you about training consultation opportunities. The voice carried the formal courtesy that characterized military communications, but Phoenix detected underlying excitement about continued civilian aviation interest. Send them to my office in 10 minutes, she replied, then turned to Rodriguez. Captain, this is exactly what we hope to achieve. Commercial aviation seeking military expertise to improve their emergency training programs. Our work is gaining recognition where it matters most. The United Airlines representative proved to be Captain Morrison, looking more relaxed in civilian clothes, but carrying the same professional competence that had impressed Phoenix during the emergency. His presence in her office felt like completing a circle that had begun in the cockpit of a powerless airliner over Ohio.